Last year's game against Stanford was one to forget for the Ducks, but this year the Cardinal come into Autzen Stadium, and though Stanford should be better than the 3-9 record they showed in 2021, the Ducks should still be fine in 2022. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thanks to everybody out there who has done so already. I'm joined today on the show, as I have been many times in the past before and will be many times in the future as well, by Max Torres. He's host of the Ducks Dish podcast, publisher over at DucksDigest.com, covering Oregon for Fan Nation at Sports Illustrated. Max, good to have you on to talk about this matchup with Stanford here in week 5, I believe it is, which is just not that far away.
Yeah, no, excited to be back, Spencer. Always fun talking with you. And today's start of fall camp for Oregon, so there's plenty to be excited about. We finally made it through the off season.
Yeah, this is another one of the episodes we're recording well in advance. But as we record this, yes, fall camp is just starting, and the football juices are flowing in every Oregon fan's veins right now because we got players on the field, we got pads hitting each other, we got gosh, I can't wait. Okay, so let's get into this game with Stanford, and let's just try and completely wipe from our memories whatever in the world happened last year down in Palo Alto. I think no Joe Moorhead was a factor. I think Anthony Brown was terrible. I think the officiating was worse, but Stanford shouldn't have been in that game anyway because it wasn't a very good Cardinal team. Let's not even bring it up. That's it. That's all we're mentioning for last year. Let's focus on 2022. I expect the Cardinals to be much better. They were not good last year. I mean, it was a major, major upset when you see how their seasons played out for Stanford and Oregon last year, but it was at the time, and we didn't know at the time, I guess, how poor Stanford's season was going to be. But I expect them to be better this year. However, Max, coming back to Autzen Stadium, and with how last year played out in mind, I feel pretty confident about this one for the Ducks.
Yeah, this is a game that always has a lot on the line. It feels like, it's always one of the more, highly anticipated rivalries within the Pac-12, certainly within the North Division. When Stanford comes to town or when the Cardinal and the Ducks play each other, there's always not a hatred, but I think that they kind of bring out the best in each other between these two teams. Maybe more
respect.
So than some.
I think respect.
Yeah, there's definitely a big respect between the two, and I think that Oregon's happy that they get this game at home, no doubt, especially after what happened last year. And I think there's just a lot to be excited about. This should definitely be a game that Oregon feels good about with the pieces that they have returning, and I think we could talk about this more later. I think just with how they match up on the outside, with the length they have at receiver now.
Yeah, and I feel like Oregon was in a position last year, even with the early interception from Anthony Brown, which was one of several poor ones that he threw last season. The Washington one was pretty bad. The Utah one in the Pac-12 championship game was the worst, still the worst interception I've ever seen in my entire life. But that one was pretty bad. It got off to a rough start, but then it looked like Oregon had settled in and was going to be able to get a victory, but went for it at the end of the half rather than getting yourself a two-possession lead and what would have been the difference, kicking a field goal, and Anthony Brown didn't pitch it to C.J. Verdell. Like, there were just so many things throughout the course of that game where you look at it and go, what's happening here? It had that feel of just playing down to your competition rather than coming out with an aggressive mentality. I don't know how much the loss of Joe Moorhead was affecting that on offense, but they just never looked like they were clicking, and the Stanford defense was able to do enough. And then that final drive, aided by some very poor officiating, was just pretty disheartening to watch, frankly. But now Oregon is, I think, in a place where emotionally you have enough players who are on that team last year who remember how that game played out, who I think will be more than a little ticked off. I don't think necessarily at the Stanford players per se, but just the emotions of that game, they stick with you, right? At least for one season, that they can stick with you. There's certain games you don't forget. I think that's one where guys like Noah Sewell, the offensive line, some of the receivers will kind of be taking it personally. I think they'll come in this game with an edge to them that they just didn't have on the road last year, but in front of the home fans, I think they'll be revitalized from that standpoint. I expect them to come out and be playing fast and hard early.
Yeah, you mentioned Noah Sewell. He's actually a player that I remember pretty vividly from that game when I was out there on the farm. The game was winding down, and he's really just the Iron Man of that defense, maybe even of that team. His body just was taking a beating. Like that's just such a physical matchup, a physical game against Stanford that is going to wear on you. And it was just such a raw moment seeing him kind of walking back and forth, getting the defense set up, and calling out everything between the plays. So Noah Sewell, I mean, that's a guy that you are for sure gonna see a lot of fire out of. Seeing that he wants to get his side of the ball fired up, but I think that Oregon has a lot of experience where it matters most, especially against Stanford, since we're spotlighting this matchup, and that's in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line. They really have a lot of proven contributors there. I think what's really going to be a key here is how the young secondary matches up with Stanford's passing game. And then is Oregon going to be able to get some good pass rush off in this game and really try to get to Tanner McKee?
Yeah, and let's go to the Stanford offense and give Duck fans an idea of what to expect there. You still got David Shaw as the head coach, though if things don't go well this season, or at least there's no improvement, maybe his seat starts to get a little warm underneath him. But he's had a lot of wins there. He's been in a lot of football games. You know what you're going to get from him stylistically, and he's got another surprisingly, somewhat, NFL caliber quarterback in Tanner McKee. Was just flying under the radar, but Davis Mills was I didn't know this until I started hosting Locked On Pac-12, a five-star prospect himself, and he's now getting a real chance there with the Houston Texans. But McKee is a guy he's a very prototypical Stanford quarterback. He's big, he's not super mobile, he's tall, and he's got a pretty good arm as well. I think when you look at what David Shaw wants to do, he's not going to have McKee throw the ball 45, 50 times a game like Mike Leach would. They still want to start with the power run. But I think David Shaw also understands what he has in Tanner McKee and what that allows his offense to do.
Yeah, Stanford's another one of those teams that really feels like they're run first. I think back to 5 or so years ago when they would come out in those massive jumbo sets, practically screaming, "We're running the ball. You just need to do something to stop us." But I think that what always fascinates me about Stanford is kind of just the way that their roster is assembled every year. It just seems like they're not really so much of a recruiting powerhouse, although they're starting to pick up some steam, I think, on the recruiting trail. You have them out at St. John Bosco getting a couple guys here and there is someone that comes to mind. And then just the way that their players complement each other. I think that the tight ends, that's pretty much tight end you. I think they're certainly right there in the conversation with your Iowa, as well as who else you got? I mean, Bama's putting out some guys too. But those are the two biggest schools there. But I think that their tight ends and then their wide receivers as well, they have such a good blend of size and speed. And they also have some gadget guys that they can throw at you. No Austin Jones this year for Stanford, but I think they should be all right in that backfield. They still have some talented ball carriers there. But that is one big theme that's always kind of stuck out for me with these David Shaw teams is, no matter, it feels like no matter how much they lose, they always kind of bring in their kind of guy, and those players seem to fit their needs and do whatever it is that they really need them to do at any given time.
And we'll talk about some of those players and how Oregon might match up with them this year. But first, I tell you about a Built Bar, and they've got a new flavor because Built, as always, has done it again. The Built Bar Puffs have now got a cookie dough flavor, one of life's greatest joys. All the joys of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it, and it's healthy for you. 160 calories, a whopping 15 grams of protein in them. Run to built.com to snag a box for you and the family. It'll be the perfect treat, or you can find a really good hiding place and just kind of hoard them for yourself. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order to get your cookie dough chunk puffs. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So they don't have a Christian McCaffrey type back per se, or they kind of do, Stanford this year. The E.J. Smith, who's the son of legendary NFL running back Emmitt Smith, is expected to be one of the principal guys. He can line up in the slot and catch passes, and I, had that initial reaction to comparing him to McCaffrey because no one really is Christian McCaffrey. But when I think of Stanford and the teams they've had over the years, they haven't always needed a Christian McCaffrey type to be good, right? Like you said, they need their sort of guys and understand how to use their personnel, and they're always very offensive line dependent rather than being dependent on a guy like McCaffrey who's just ridiculously good. But no Austin Jones. He and Oregon running back Travis Dye are down at USC with Lincoln Riley now, so both teams will be integrating new ball carriers this year. But to me, that doesn't make me think less of how Stanford will be able to run the ball.
Yeah, and then another person that they lost from last year's roster was Nathaniel Pete, who was actually the team's leading rusher. It felt a lot like him and Austin Jones, that there wasn't much of a drop off. When one of those guys had to rotate in. From the times I was able to watch Stanford last year, 107 carries for Austin Jones, 79 carries for Nathaniel Pete. So it does kind of feel like this is EJ Smith's job to lose, I would say, just on the outside looking in early in the season. But maybe you'll have a chance for some of these younger guys to get a little bit more involved as well. Someone that comes to mind is Casey Filkins, who's from the state of Oregon, and I thought he was kind of an under the radar addition to their signing class that year. Excuse me. I think that Stanford always has a strong offensive line. Maybe not so much in this past season because they were at that 3-9 marker that you're not used to seeing them hit. So I think that this year Stanford just wants to get back to doing Stanford, and that they did. I mean, last year wasn't completely lost. I mean, look at that last drive against Oregon. You can call it the officials if you want, but not to bring it up again, but like that was still, kind of like Oregon's kryptonite on defense against Stanford. And it was like, we're going to toss it up to these massive wideout tight end hybrids and make it happen. So I think Stanford's going to get back to doing what they do best. They have some really talented pieces there. Obviously a lot younger at the running back position now with some of those losses we talked about, but they're pretty loaded at wideout with a bunch of returning production.
Yeah, I think they've got some good skill pieces there for McKee to work with, and I'll be interested to see how the passing defense can improve. It's not like McKee absolutely scorched them for 40 points or anything a year ago, but when the Oregon defense needed to get a stop last year, they couldn't. And this is going to be a very different looking secondary. You don't have DJ James, no McHale Wright, no Verone McKinley. Those are 3 or 4 starters from a season ago, and that other safety spot kind of rotated in and out. So how do you feel right now about Oregon's defense against the Stanford offense, knowing what we know about the skill position players, but also how David Shaw, wants to play offensively and how he wants to score points and such? Like, how confident do you feel in the Ducks' ability to slow down the Cardinal?
I feel pretty confident about it for sure. I think, like I said, that pass rush is a huge question mark that needs to be answered.
Yeah.
Oregon has plenty of guys that can try to fill the void left by Kayvon Thibodeau, which is a massive void. But I think if you're Oregon, you don't necessarily need a star. You just need a handful of guys that can give you some push and then come up with some sacks when you really need it. So you got DJ Johnson, Braden Swinson as some big guys that stand out. Mace Funa is another one. Maybe we'll see more of Trevin Mae. And then Brandon Dorlus is someone who can really get some push on that interior, I think, not just a run stopper. So I feel like that those guys are going to emerge hopefully by that time, that week in the schedule. You have some time to gel and get some games under your belt. I think that after playing a team like Georgia, and then BYU is going to be no pushover either, they're going to be very well experienced in the trenches just in terms of, getting hit in the mouth and going against some really physical teams. So that's a benefit of Oregon's tough non-conference schedule. And then on the back end, I think that's where there's a little bit more question just because they did lose a lot of pieces, whether it's at safety or cornerback. But I think that this is going to be a big game to see how Christian Gonzalez can kind of match up with the rest of the Pac-12 wide receivers. He's their biggest corner, I believe, around 6'2". But Dan Lanning and Demetrius Martin have really prioritized, and the Matt Powledge for that matter as well, really prioritized length and speed in their defensive backs. Lanning was talking a little bit ago about think it was at Pac-12 Media Day when I was talking to him. He was saying that speed really kind of helps, make up for some of those mistakes that you might be making. And then obviously length does too. If you can, reach a little bit farther out and get your hand on a ball that someone else set shorter than you might not be able to, there's obviously a lot of benefit with that. So they have some experience at both safety and corner, and they're moving guys all over the place. This could be I think I said it last year, but you could probably, it's worth saying again, big game for Triquez Bridges, seeing that he's a lengthier defensive back for Oregon. Brian Addison as well. Dominic Dalton, the Hawaii transfer, is 6'4", so maybe we see him involved a little bit more in this game. So I think the talent's there, but that, like I said, with the guys in the trenches, because of that non-conference schedule, these guys are going to get tested and tested in a big way early. So look for that experience to hopefully translate over to this game against Stanford. I think it'll be a tough matchup, but because of the caliber of athlete that they've been recruiting at Oregon, and then certainly with the way they've tried to fill some of these needs since Dan Lanning's arrival, I think that they're well positioned to be competitive there, slowing down the Cardinal on defense.
I think when you're talking about matching up with Stanford's tight ends, which you always have to, right? They have a freshman in this class coming in who might see some time. Like, you just know they've been churning out guys at that position who are NFL caliber year after year after year. I think there are four names that come to mind for me. You mentioned one, Triquez Bridges, to match up with those tight ends in coverage. Jamal Hill and Bennett Williams, kind of bigger bodied guys, hybrid safety, linebacker sort of players. Jamal Hill and Bennett Williams for sure, and then Jeffrey Bassa is the other one who I think needs to be able to be effective in coverage with how Stanford likes to use these guys, not just in the red zone, but moving the ball down the field as well. Let's switch to Oregon offensively here. When you think about the Ducks and what we know about the offense right now, we presume Bo Nix will be the starter here. The Ducks did not score as many points as they should have a season ago, right? Anthony Brown, bad interception, didn't pitch it to C.J. Verdell on the option on 4th and goal. I think that Stanford defensive line with a new player or with an incoming true freshman who seems to be a pretty promising player for David Shaw defensively is always going to be tough to run against in some respect. I feel like Bo Nix has to have one of his better games here. I don't think he needs to go for 303 touchdowns or anything, but I don't think that this is a game where the Ducks offense can just rely on the running game to go for 250 yards and then only pass for 200 or so. I think this is one where you're going to have to throw for more yards than you run for, and the weapons that you mentioned earlier, I think they're going to have to come out in this game, even with a shutdown corner like Caillou Blue Kelly. Pretty sure he's a corner. He might be a safety, but really talented defensive back for Stanford, preseason All Pac-12 performer, and he was that a season ago as well. Like, he's a really good player. And Bailey is the freshman that's coming in on the defensive line, who might be a problem in the pass rush game. But I think this is one where Oregon's receivers and maybe give Stanford a taste of their own medicine. Use the tight ends, Terrence Ferguson, Maliki Mataval, maybe a Patrick Herbert or Cam McCormick slides in there for a big catch or two. I think the air attack is going to have to be more prominent than the ground game here, just because Stanford's always tough to run against.
Yeah, they are always tough to run against. Although, I mean, last year at least I was looking at the stats and they were giving up about 5.5 yards a pop to the ground game. But
Yeah.
they're certainly going to be a physical team, and I think that part of the reason that you could point to Oregon losing last year is because they were overly reliant on the run game, and they weren't able to use the passing attack as efficiently as they would have wanted to. Definitely could have helped keep the Stanford defense honest and on their toes quite a bit more. But I really liked what you said about giving Stanford a taste of their own medicine, because it feels like Oregon's really well positioned to do that because of the way this roster is constructed, especially on the outside. I think that the wide receiver room has undergone a pretty significant transformation from a personnel standpoint just since the offseason. Chase Cota coming back to his home state is someone that you want to keep an eye on. You have Caleb Chapman as well. That's hopefully going to be able to give you a better presence down the field in the deep game.
The skinnies. Don't forget the skinnies.
Oh, yeah. No, I was getting there. I was just touching on some of the new faces. But, yeah, Dante Thornton looks like he's really chiseled out his frame, and he's looking to play a more physical brand of football. But was just writing about him the other day. and he's got some serious speed and explosiveness. So you want to use those big guys, but at the same time, you can't forget about maybe some of those smaller, more traditional size wide receivers, like like your Seven McGee, like your Chris Hudson. Isaiah Crocker could be in store for a big year as one of the more experienced guys in that room in Eugene. So they have a lot of really talented guys that have just been waiting to make an impact in the passing game. So I think that this could be the perfect opportunity to really let it rip and make a statement in the passing game, seeing that most people are so used to Oregon being a ground and pound team.
If Oregon wins this game, and I believe they will, though Stanford will be, I think, somewhere around 500 this year. I think they'll take a step back forward, and then in a year or two be back to, or at least close to the Stanford that we knew them to be, which is a perennial 8-11 win team in the Pac-12. Maybe that'll be the Pac-10 one day. Who knows? But not focusing on that at this point in time. So when you look at this game and think about, what it'll look like if Oregon wins, how do you think that plays out? What's kind of the best case scenario for the Ducks? And then I'll ask you about the flip side of that coin.
Yeah, I think best case scenario for the Ducks is really, I think, starting fast. You could say that for just about any game on their schedule because they have not been known as a team that really strikes their opponent in the mouth and really maintains control of a game throughout its entirety. Because we could talk about the Pac-12 after dark aspect of so many teams. I think the biggest one that really embodies that in the Pac-12 is probably Washington State. But we saw it firsthand last year. Stanford's a team that's gonna hang around if you can't win the battles that you're supposed to and take what they can give you. I think there's a perfect example of that last year with Anthony Brown's missed option pitch down near the goal line and then some of the interceptions. So Stanford, even though they're coming off of a very rough season, they're talented, and I feel like I still want to say that they're well coached. I don't think that last season is something that we're going to see regularly for David Shaw and the Cardinal. So I think best case for Oregon, you come out strong, you score early, and you can come up with some big stops and get some hits on Tanner McKee, push them back in the run game, and be disruptive in the passing game, and then just take care of your business on offense. I think that maybe there's a little bit more work to be done on defense than offense for this particular matchup, but that's kind of how I see a best case scenario for Oregon, and then get out to a commanding lead and really just have your pedal to the metal in this one.
I think the other reason that you bring up a good point there about starting fast is Stanford at their peak is either in a dogfight throughout the game or they have the lead early and they kill the clock and play ball control, right? But if you go out and jump on them 17-3 or something, or even 14-3 or something like that, you put them in a mindset and a mentality from an offensive point of view that they don't want to be in. That's not what David Shaw wants to do, where he'd have to abandon the run. Now, is Tanner McKee a good quarterback? Yeah. Is he amazing? No, not at this point in time. And so if you told me that Oregon had a 14-3 lead, I'd feel a lot better about that than, obviously being down 7-3, but just from a standpoint of getting to a place where it's a comfortable win rather than a nail biter. I think if Oregon starts fast, you make Stanford do things they don't want to do, and that's air the ball out more and have to kind of use the run game as a supplement to it. Whereas David Shaw wants to be the other way around. He wants to power run, control the clock, lean on that offensive line, and then use the passing game to complement it. I see Stanford getting this win somehow. If, again, I think Oregon's going to win, but if Stanford were to win this game, I think that's what it would be. It would not be any different, I don't think, than any other time Stanford has knocked off Oregon. They had that crazy win that, again, very easily should have been a Ducks victory if not for snapping the ball twice in a row over Justin Herbert's head with our All-American center Jake Hansen. Like that's a big time fluke right there. But still, Oregon should have won that game, and the late fumble by C.J. Verdell, and he redeemed himself a couple weeks later. But again, how did that game play out? It wasn't a shootout. It was kind of low scoring. It was a battle of two physical football teams. Oregon was dominating that until that scoop and score by Joey Alfieri. Also, I forgot to shout out Casey Filkins. He and I went to the same high school at Lake Oswego in the Portland area. But Joey Alfieri, Jesuit guy, goes down to Stanford, makes a big play there, turns the game, and Stanford gets it done. But it's just hanging around, and I think that if Stanford pulls this upset here, and I would definitely consider it an upset again as it was a season ago, and I think with where the records will be at that point in time, it would be. I think it'll look the same way it always has, which is you keep Oregon's offense off the field, you win time of possession, and you just kind of wear down the other team and wear down the clock.
Yeah, I think more so than any other matchup, I like the point you make about clock management and how has Oregon traditionally kind of navigated that in the past. It's with an explosive offense. If Stanford's running the clock down and then you only have so much time to make something happen on offense, you got to be able to air it out and create explosive plays, which is something they haven't been able to do consistently. Certainly last year, but you could argue even a little bit more so the year before that. So I think one of the biggest themes I'm going to be looking for Oregon this season is balance in the running and passing game. And then just who are the playmakers? Who are the guys that emerge throughout the season? Maybe some of them carry over from last year, but I think for the most part, it's going to be a lot of new faces at the skill positions that emerge as your consistent playmakers and someone that you can turn to when you really need a big play. So Stanford, Oregon is pretty much always a really promising matchup. Maybe it'll be one that they can get in prime time on that day. Who knows? Maybe a game day type of deal. Depends where those teams are both at. But should be an exciting matchup for both teams, and certainly will be an interesting game for Dan Lanning as a defensive guy, just figuring out how to navigate David Shaw. Maybe those guys are going blow for blow, throwing counter punches, what have you. Maybe Dan Lanning gets creative on defense with the scheme and maybe some of the personnel he deploys. There's just so much to be excited about with that game.
Max Torres, you hit him up on Twitter at mtorresports. He hosts the Ducks Dish podcast and covers Oregon for Fan Nation at Sports Illustrated. Max, it's great to have you on as always, man, and we will talk soon as the season looms ever closer.
Appreciate you having me on, Spencer. Should be a fun season. Thank you.
I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.